Some men spend their whole lives building empires, only to realize they've built themselves a prison. Elias Boone had everything money could buy, but at 72, he sat alone at his kitchen table every morning, counting down the days until his heart would finally give out. When he paid $1 for the abandoned Whitmore Mansion at a county tax auction, he wasn't looking for an investment. He just wanted a quiet place to die away from the ranch that reminded him of all the family he'd lost. The old southern mansion had been empty for decades, with vines crawling up its columns and windows boarded shut. But on his first night there, Elias found a hidden room in the basement. Inside were Civil War letters, a Confederate journal, and a photograph that stopped his heart. The woman in the picture looked exactly like his late grandmother. What family secret had been buried in this house, and why was someone willing to kill to keep it hidden? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the broken Arrow Ranch as Elias Boone stood on his front porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. At 72, his frame still carried the strength of 5 decades working cattle, but his eyes held the hollow look of a man who'd outlived his purpose. The sprawling Texas ranch stretched beyond the horizon, 20,000 acres of prime grazing land that had made him one of the wealthiest men in 3 counties. Yet for all its vastness, the place felt smaller every day. Sarah's garden had withered 2 years ago. The roses she tended with such care, now nothing but thorny stems poking through cracked earth. He couldn't bring himself to water them after the cancer took her. Couldn't bring himself to do much of anything except watch the hired hands manage what he built with his own blood and sweat. The ranch ran itself now, a well-oiled machine that no longer needed its creator. "Morning, Mr. Boone." Jake Martinez, his foreman of 15 years, approached with a clipboard tucked under his arm. "Got those cattle futures reports you wanted?" Elias nodded without turning. "Just leave 'em on the kitchen table. You boys can handle whatever needs handling." Jake hesitated, shifting his weight from one boot to the other. "Sir, you sure you're feeling all right?" "Been 3 weeks, so he rode out to check the north pasture." "I'm fine, Jake. Just tired." The lie came easily now. Truth was, Elias felt like a ghost haunting his own life, watching from the outside as the world moved on without him. The doctor said his heart was strong enough for another 10 years, maybe more. The prospect filled him with a dread he couldn't name. After Jake left, Elias retreated to his study, a dark-paneled room lined with leather-bound books Sarah had insisted he'd never read. She'd been right about most things, including that. His desk held a stack of mail he'd been ignoring for weeks, but one envelope caught his attention. It bore the official seal of Vermilion Parish, Louisiana. Inside was a notice about a tax auction, a list of foreclosed properties being sold to recover unpaid debts. Most were small plots of worthless swampland, but one entry made him pause. Whitmore Mansion and Grounds. 1847 Creole plantation home, 50 acres. Minimum bid $1. He'd heard of the Whitmore place from his grandmother Elena when he was young. She'd spoken of it in whispers, always crossing herself when the name came up. Something about a family tragedy during the war between the states, about how the house had stood empty ever since. Local folks said it was cursed, though his grandmother never explained what that meant. Elias stared at the notice for a long time. $1 for a mansion. It seemed fitting, somehow a rich man's joke about the value of things nobody wanted. More importantly, it was 500 miles away from the ranch, from the memories that haunted every corner of this place. That evening, he called his lawyer in Houston. "Tom, I need you to handle something for me." "Of course, Elias. What can I do?" "There's a tax auction in Louisiana next week. I want you to bid on a property for me." Tom's voice carried concern. "Are you thinking of expanding the operation?" "Because I should mention, the cattle market's been no expansion. I'm thinking of leaving." A pause. "Leaving?" Elias, the broken arrow is your life's work. You can't just, I can do whatever I damn well please with what's mine. The words came out harsher than he'd intended. Sorry, Tom. I just need a change of scenery. 3 days later, Tom called back with news that surprised no one. You're now the owner of the Whitmore Mansion, Elias. Only bidder, as it turns out. Cost you exactly $1, plus filing fees. Elias had expected to feel something satisfaction, perhaps, or buyer's remorse. Instead, he felt nothing at all, which somehow seemed appropriate. He spent the next week putting his affairs in order, signing papers that gave Jake full authority over the ranch's operations. The man had earned it, and Elias trusted him to keep the legacy alive even if its founder had given up caring. The drive to Louisiana took 2 days. His old Ford pickup loaded with the few possessions that still held meaning. Sarah's jewelry box. His father's cavalry saber from the Spanish-American War. A photograph of him and Sarah on their wedding day. Everything else could rot with the ranch as far as he was concerned. He reached the town of Magnolia Bend, just as the afternoon heat was settling into that oppressive blanket that defined Louisiana summers. The main street looked like something from a postcard that time had. Forgotten antebellum homes with wide porches and hanging moss. A courthouse with peeling white paint. Elderly men playing checkers outside a general store. The mansion sat 3 miles outside town, down a dirt road that disappeared into a tunnel of ancient live oaks. Elias felt his breath catch when he first glimpsed it through the trees. The house rose from the overgrowth like a ship emerging from fog, its Greek revival columns still proud despite decades of neglect. Ivy climbed the brick walls and thick ropes, and several shutters hung askew, but the basic structure appeared sound. He parked in what had once been a circular drive, now cracked and sprouting weeds. As he climbed the front steps, the boards groaned under his weight, and he wondered if he'd bought himself a death trap along with a refuge. The front door was solid mahogany, its brass hardware green with patina. The key the parish clerk had given him turned easily, and the door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo through the house's bones. The interior took his breath away. A grand staircase curved up from the foyer, its banister carved from what looked like imported walnut. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through broken shutters, and the air carried the scent of old wood and faded roses. For a moment, he could almost see the house as it had been ladies in hoop skirts gliding down those stairs, gentlemen in tailcoats raising glasses of bourbon in the parlor. Well, I'll be damned. The voice came from behind him, and Elias spun around to find an elderly black woman standing in the doorway. She was small and bird-like, probably in her 80s, wearing a faded floral dress and carrying a wicker basket. "Ma'am," Elias nodded, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm Elias Boone. I just bought this place." "I know who you are, honey. Word travels fast in a small town." She stepped into the foyer, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "I'm Evangeline Thibodeau. Been living in the caretaker's cottage for nigh on 60 years now. I wasn't told there was a caretaker." Mrs. Thibodeau chuckled, a dry sound like autumn leaves. "Wasn't official. You understand. Just kept an eye on things. Made sure the vandals didn't carry off everything that wasn't nailed down. Been expecting someone like you for a long time." "Someone like me?" "Someone running from ghosts, honey. Takes one to know one." She set her basket on a dust-covered table and began unpacking what looked like cleaning supplies. "Brought you some things to get started. Figure you'll be wanting to make the place livable." Elias watched her work, amused. "Mrs. Thibodeau, you don't have to. Course I don't have to. I want to." She paused in her unpacking and fixed him with a stare that seemed to see right through him. "This house has been waiting for someone who understands what it means to lose everything. But I got to warn you about something." "What's that?" "There's things in this house that don't like being disturbed. The Whitmores, they were good people, but they carried secrets that died with them. Some secrets got a way of staying buried for good reason. Before Elias could ask what she meant, Mrs. Thibodeau had gathered her empty basket and headed for the door. "I'll be back tomorrow with some groceries and such. You get yourself settled, but mind what I said about leaving things be." That night, after arranging his few belongings in the master bedroom and eating a cold sandwich for dinner, Elias explored the house room by room. Most of the furniture remained, covered in dust sheets that gave everything the appearance of ghosts. The library held hundreds of volumes, their leather bindings cracked but readable. The kitchen was a marvel of 1920s renovation, with modern appliances that hadn't been modern for decades. It was in the basement that he found the anomaly. The main cellar was what he'd expected: stone walls, wooden shelves, the remnants of a wine collection. But in the far corner, behind a wall of rotting wooden planks, he could see a gap that suggested a room beyond. The planks were old and brittle, coming away easily when he pried at them with a crowbar he'd found hanging on the wall. Behind them was a small chamber, perhaps 10 feet square, with stone walls and no windows. The air that escaped was stale and cold, carrying scents of old paper and something else, something that reminded him of the battlefield. Museums he'd visited as a young man by flashlight. He could make out the contents of the hidden room. In the center sat a hand-carved wooden box, its Confederate battle flag inlay still visible despite years of tarnish. Beside it lay scattered papers, a leather journal, and what appeared to be an old military revolver. But it was the framed photograph leaning against the wall that made his blood run cold. The woman in the picture was young, perhaps 20, with dark hair arranged in the fashion of the 1860s. She wore a simple dress and held a serious expression. But her eyes were unmistakably familiar. They were his grandmother Elena's eyes, set in his grandmother Elena's face, looking out at him from a photograph that had to be decades older than Elena could possibly have been. Elias sank to his knees beside the wooden box, his hands shaking as he reached for the journal. The leather cover was soft with age, and the pages whispered as he opened to the first entry. Written in a careful hand, "My name is Captain James Whitmore, 5th 10th Louisiana Infantry, and if anyone finds this record, know that I died loving a woman I could never have, for reasons that will die with me." Elias spent the night reading Captain James Whitmore's journal by lamplight in the hidden room, his back aching from hunching over the fragile pages. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and impossible. According to the entries, James had deserted from the Confederate Army in the winter of 1863. Not from cowardice, but from love. The woman in the photograph was Elena Vasquez, a Mexican settler's daughter who had come to Louisiana with her family to escape the violence sweeping through Texas. James had met her at a church social in 1862. Before the war consumed everything decent in the world, they had fallen in love despite the growing tensions between her family's Union sympathies and his Confederate commission. "She carries herself like a queen," James had written, "but speaks to me as if I were the only man in the world who mattered. When this war ends, I will marry her if she'll have me, and we will build a life worthy of the love we share." But the war had not ended quickly, and James faced an impossible choice when his regiment was ordered to participate in a raid against suspected Union sympathizers, a raid that would have targeted Elena's family among others. He had chosen love over duty, abandoning his post to warn her family and help them escape north. The journal entries grew darker after that decision. James had returned to the mansion in secret, using the hidden room to avoid Confederate patrols searching for deserters. He had planned to wait out the war and then follow Elena north, but something had gone wrong. The final entries spoke of betrayal, of someone who had discovered his hiding place and threatened to expose not only his desertion but Elena's family's location. "I fear I have been a fool," read the last complete entry. "The man I trusted with my secret has proven to have loyalties that supersede friendship. He demands I return to my regiment and face execution or he will see that Elena's family pays the price for my cowardice. I have one final card to play, though it may cost me everything." The entry ended there. But tucked between the journal's back pages, Elias found a letter written in a different hand, a woman's hand. "My dearest James," it began, "I write this knowing I may never see you again, but I must tell you that your sacrifice was not in vain. My family reached safety because of your warning, and we will never forget the price you paid for our freedom. I am with child, your child, and though I cannot bear your name, I will give the baby mine and tell them every day of the brave man who was their father." The letter was signed, "Forever yours, Elena Vasquez." Elias read it 3 times before the full implication struck him. If this Elena was his grandmother, if she had borne James Whitmore's child, then Elias carried the blood of both Union sympathizers and Confederate deserters. His entire understanding of his family's history crumbled in that basement room. But how was it possible? His grandmother Elena had always claimed her husband was Miguel Boone, a rancher who had died young in a cattle drive accident. She had never mentioned Louisiana, never spoken of the war years except to cross herself and mutter prayers in Spanish. Yet here was proof that she had lived another life, loved another man, carried secrets that shaped everything that came after. A sound from upstairs interrupted his thoughts. A creaking that was too rhythmic to be the house settling. Someone was walking across the floor above him. Elias checked his watch. 3:30 in the morning. He carefully closed the journal and made his way up the basement stairs, moving as quietly as his old bones would allow. The main floor was dark, except for moonlight filtering through the damaged shutters. Elias grabbed a poker from the fireplace and crept toward the front of the house, following the sound of footsteps that seemed to pace back and forth in the parlor. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish. "Anyone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. Elias waited, counting his heartbeats in the sudden silence, then moved toward the parlor doorway. The room was empty, furniture still covered in dust sheets. But the air felt different, charged with an electricity that made his skin crawl. On the mantelpiece, where he was certain nothing had been before, sat a daguerreotype in a silver frame. Even in the moonlight, he could see it showed a young Confederate officer in dress uniform, his face bearing an unmistakable resemblance to the features Elias saw in his own mirror every morning. A business card was propped against the frame, its edges crisp and white as if it had been placed there moments before. "Marcus Whitmore Historical Research and Genealogy," it read, with a local phone number printed below. Elias picked up the card with trembling fingers. Marcus Whitmore. A descendant of James, perhaps, or someone who had taken the family name for other reasons. Either way, it seemed impossible that someone had entered the house, left this calling card, and departed without him hearing a door open or close. He spent the rest of the night sitting in the kitchen, the poker across his lap, watching the eastern windows for signs of dawn. When Mrs. Thibodeau arrived at 8 o'clock with a basket of groceries and a thermos of coffee, she found him hollow-eyed and shaken. "Lord have mercy," she said, taking in his appearance. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." Elias showed her the business card and told her about the night's events. Mrs. Thibodeau listened without interruption, her face growing graver with each detail. "Marcus Whitmore," she repeated when he finished. "Yeah, I know about him. He's been sniffing around this place for the better part of 20 years, trying to get access to the house. Claims he's researching his family history." "You think he broke in last night?" "Honey, that man has keys to this house that go back generations. The Whitmores never truly left this place, if you catch my meaning." She poured coffee from her thermos and pushed the cup toward him. "Question is, what does he want with you?" As if summoned by their conversation, a knock sounded at the front door. Through the window, Elias could see a man in his 50s standing on the porch, wearing a white linen suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He was tall and thin, with graying hair and the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent most of his time indoors with old books and documents. "Mr. Boone?" the man called through the door. "My name is Marcus Whitmore. I believe you found my calling card." Mrs. Thibodeau grabbed Elias's arm. "You don't have to let him in. That man brings nothing but trouble." But Elias was already moving toward the door, driven by a curiosity stronger than his caution. He had questions that needed answers, and Marcus Whitmore might be the only person alive who could provide them. The man on the porch was exactly what his voice had suggested: scholarly, soft-spoken, with eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He smiled when Elias opened the door, but the expression never reached those calculating eyes. "Mr. Boone, thank you for seeing me. I hope I haven't caught you at an inconvenient time." His accent was educated Southern, the kind they taught at expensive universities. "I understand you've recently become the owner of my family's ancestral home." "Your family?" "Oh, yes. I'm the great-great-nephew of Captain James Whitmore, the original owner. I've been researching our family history for decades, and I believe this house holds documents that could shed light on some long-standing mysteries." Elias stepped aside to let him enter, ignoring Mrs. Thibodeau's disapproving stare. "What kind of mysteries?" Marcus set his briefcase on the hall table and opened it, withdrawing a folder thick with papers. "Well, for starters, the mystery of what happened to my ancestor during the final year of the war. He simply vanished from all military records in late 1863, and there's no record of his death or burial. Family legend suggests he may have hidden something valuable in this house before he disappeared." "What makes you think I'd know anything about that?" Marcus smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in the expression. "Because, Mr. Boone, according to my research, your family and mine have been connected for much longer than you might realize. In fact, I believe we're practically cousins." He opened the folder and spread photographs across the table, dozens of daguerreotypes and tintypes showing faces that bore unmistakable resemblances to both men. At the center of the collection was a copy of the same photograph Elias had found in the basement, the one showing Elena Vasquez. "Your grandmother, I believe," Marcus said softly. "The woman who broke my great-great-uncle's heart and stole something that belonged to our family. I think it's time we settled that old debt, don't you?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Elias stared at the photograph spread across his hall table, his mind struggling to process what Marcus Whitmore was suggesting. The faces looking back at him were undeniably familiar. The strong jaw he'd inherited from his father's side, the dark eyes that had been passed down through generations of Boones. "What exactly are you claiming my grandmother stole?" Elias kept his voice level, but his hands had unconsciously clenched into fists. Marcus reached into his briefcase and withdrew another document, a property deed yellowed with age. "This house, Mr. Boone, according to Confederate military law, when James Whitmore deserted his post, his property should have been seized by the state. Instead, it appears your grandmother somehow acquired legal title to the mansion and its contents before fleeing north." "That's impossible. My grandmother never owned property in Louisiana." "Are you certain?" Marcus's smile was thin and cold. "Because my research suggests otherwise. Elena Vasquez, your grandmother, lived in this house for nearly 6 months after James disappeared. Local records show she gave birth here in the master bedroom upstairs. The child was registered as Elena Boone, using the surname she would later claim belonged to her deceased husband." Mrs. Thibodeau had been standing quietly in the kitchen doorway, but now she stepped forward. "Marcus Whitmore, you got no business dredging up old pain. Some things are better left buried." "Mrs. Thibodeau," Marcus nodded to her with mock courtesy. "Still protecting the family secrets, I see. How admirable. But Mr. Boone deserves to know the truth about his heritage, don't you think?" Elias felt the walls of his new refuge closing in around him. He had come here seeking peace, an escape from the ghost that haunted his ranch. Instead, He had stumbled into a graveyard of family secrets that threatened to upend everything he thought he knew about himself. "Let's say you're right," he said finally. "Let's say my grandmother lived here and somehow acquired the legal title to this property. What does that have to do with you? If she owned it legitimately, then I bought it legitimately." Marcus laughed a sound without warmth or humor. "Legitimately? Mr. Boone, your grandmother acquired this property through theft and murder. She didn't just break James's heart, she broke his neck." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. "That's a hell of an accusation to make without proof." "Oh, I have proof." Marcus pulled out another folder, this one containing modern photographs and what appeared to be official documents. 3 years ago, I finally obtained permission to conduct a ground-penetrating radar survey of this property. We found what we were looking for in the old family cemetery behind the house. He spread the photographs on the table. They showed a section of overgrown graveyard, ancient headstones tilting at odd angles among the Spanish moss. But one area had been cleared and marked with modern surveying equipment. We found James's remains buried in an unmarked grave, 50 yards from the family plot. His skull showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma. Marcus tapped one of the photographs. Someone killed him and hid the body. The timeline suggests it happened right around the time your grandmother left for Texas. Elias studied the photographs, his stomach churning. If Marcus was telling the truth, then his grandmother had not been the innocent victim of war he'd always imagined. But something about the man's presentation troubled him. Too neat, too convenient, like a case built to reach a predetermined conclusion. "Why bring this to me now?" Elias asked. "If you had evidence of murder, why not take it to the authorities years ago?" "Because, Mr. Boone, I'm not interested in justice for a crime that's over a century old. I'm interested in recovering what James hid before he died, something your grandmother never found. Or she would have taken it with her to Texas. What are you talking about?" Marcus closed his briefcase with a decisive snap. "James Whitmore didn't just desert from the Confederate Army, Mr. Boone. He stole something from them first, something valuable enough that men are still willing to kill for it today. And according to his journal, he hid it somewhere in this house." "His journal?" Elias kept his expression neutral, but his heart was racing. "What journal? Don't play coy with me. I know you found the hidden room in the basement. I've been watching this house for 20 years, waiting for someone to discover what James left behind. The question is, are you going to be reasonable about this, or do I need to take more direct action?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Elias glanced toward Mrs. Thibodeau, who had gone pale during Marcus's presentation. Whatever this man wanted, she clearly knew more about it than she'd been willing to share. "I think you should leave," Elias said. "If you have some legal claim to this property, you can take it up with my lawyer." "Legal claims can be so messy and time-consuming," Marcus replied, moving toward the door. "I much prefer to handle these matters between gentlemen. But I should warn you, I'm not the only person interested in what James hid. There are others who lack my patience and civility." He paused at the threshold and turned back. "I'll give you 3 days to consider my proposal, Mr. Boone. Find what James hid. Turn it over to me, and I'll ensure you can live out your remaining years in peace. Refuse, and I can't guarantee your safety." After Marcus left, Elias and Mrs. Thibodeau sat in the kitchen, the weight of unspoken truths settling between them like dust on abandoned furniture. How much of what he said was true? Elias asked finally. Mrs. Thibodeau sighed deeply, suddenly looking every one of her 80-plus years. "More than I wish, honey. Your grandmother did live here for a time, and she did leave sudden-like after James disappeared. But murder?" She shook her head. "Elena Vasquez was many things, but she wasn't no killer. Then what really happened? I was just a child then, but I remember the night she left. There was shouting from the big house, men's voices raised in anger. My mama sent me to bed early, but I could hear them arguing about something. Next morning, Elena was gone, and we never saw James again. Who were the men arguing? That's the thing, I only recognized one voice. And it wasn't James. It was his brother Thomas, the one who'd been trying to court Elena before James came home from the war. Mrs. Thibodeau's eyes grew distant with memory. Thomas always was a jealous man, and mean when he didn't get what he wanted. Elias felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align in his mind. You think Thomas killed James? I think Thomas killed James, and Elena saw it happen. Question is, what did she do with whatever it was they were fighting over? That afternoon, Elias returned to the hidden room in the basement, this time bringing proper lighting and examining everything with new eyes. The wooden box that had contained James' journal and personal effects was ornate, enough to suggest it had held something valuable. But now it was empty except for the documents and photograph. Yet as he studied the room's construction, he noticed something odd about the floor stones. One section seemed newer than the rest, the mortar lines slightly different in color and texture. Using the crowbar, he pried up the stones and found a shallow depression carved into the earth below. Whatever James had hidden there was gone. But scratched into the stone at the bottom of the hiding place was a message in Spanish, written in a feminine hand. Para mi hijo busca de Los Angeles Lauren. For my son, look where the angels weep. His grandmother's final message, left for a descendant she would never meet, pointing toward one last secret buried somewhere in the growing darkness of the Whitmore estate. The Spanish inscription haunted Elias through the night. Busca de Los Angeles Lauren, look where the angels weep. His grandmother had been fluent in both Spanish and English, but she had chosen to leave her final message in the language of her youth, perhaps hoping that only family would understand its meaning. By dawn, he had formed a theory about where the angels might weep. Every southern plantation of the era would have had a family cemetery, and cemetery angels were common monuments for grieving families. He had noticed the graveyard during his initial exploration of the property, but had avoided it out of respect for the dead. Now it seemed the dead might hold answers he desperately needed. Mrs. Thibodeau arrived earlier than usual, carrying a thermos of coffee and a grim expression. She found Elias sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by James's papers and a hand-drawn map of the property he'd sketched from memory. You're planning to dig up that cemetery, aren't you? She said without preamble. How did you? Honey, I've been around long enough to read the signs. That look in your eyes is the same one Elena had the night before she disappeared, like someone who's made a decision they can't take back. She set down her thermos and studied his map. But you're gonna need help if you want to do this right. I can't ask you to get involved in this, Mrs. Thibodeau. Marcus made it clear there could be danger. Evangeline, she corrected. I've been involved since the day I was born on this property. My family worked for the Whitmores for 3 generations before the war, and we stayed on after. If there's something hidden in that cemetery, it's as much my business as yours. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. Besides, you're gonna need someone who knows where all the bodies are buried, literally speaking. Evangeline's knowledge of the property proved invaluable. She led him through the overgrown paths behind the house to the family cemetery, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories passed down through generations of caretakers. The graveyard was larger than he'd realized, with headstones dating back to the 1820s and spanning nearly a century of Whitmore family history. Most of the angel monuments are over here, she said, leading him to a section where elaborate marble sculptures watched over the graves of children and young wives. The Whitmores lost a lot of family to fever and childbirth complications. But the one you're looking for is probably this one. She stopped before a particularly ornate monument, a life-size marble angel kneeling beside a small headstone, her face turned upward, an expression of profound grief. Water stains streaked down the angel's cheeks like frozen tears, the result of decades of Louisiana rain washing over the porous stone. The headstone read, Baby Whitmore, born and called home, March 15, 1864. too pure for this world. Elias felt his breath catch. March 1864, 9 months after James would have disappeared. If Elena had been pregnant when she fled, this could be the grave of her child with James. The baby died? He asked. Evangeline nodded sadly. According to the records, Elena gave birth to a son, but he only lived a few hours. Broke her heart, from what my grandmother told me. She left for Texas the next week. But something about the timeline bothered Elias. If Elena had been his grandmother, and she had given birth to a son who died in 1864, then who was his grandfather? How did the Boone name come into his family line? He knelt beside the Angel Monument and began examining its base. The marble was old and weathered, but he could see tool marks where someone had worked to loosen one of the foundation stones. Using his pocket knife, he was able to pry the stone free, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside was a small leather pouch, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture for over a century. With trembling hands, Elias opened the pouch and found its contents: a handful of gold coins, some jewelry, and a letter sealed with red wax. The letter was addressed in Elena's handwriting. To the son of my heart, if God grants that you should find this. Elias broke the wax seal and unfolded the yellowed paper. Elena's final letter was longer than the one he'd found in James's journal, and it told a story that changed everything he thought he knew about his family. My beloved James is dead, the letter began. Murdered by his own brother for a treasure that was never worth a man's life. But Thomas Whitmore made one mistake, he assumed. I was just another helpless woman who would flee in terror once he had eliminated his rival. He did not know that my father taught me to shoot, or that I carried the blood of revolutionaries who died defending what they loved. I killed Thomas Whitmore in this very cemetery, buried him in an unmarked grave where he will never rest easy among the family he betrayed. The treasure he killed James for, Confederate gold meant to fund the war effort, I have hidden where only our blood can find it. But I will not use stolen money to build a life for my son. The baby you will someday bury beneath this angel is not James's child, though I let the world believe he was. My real son James's true heir I have taken with me to Texas, where he will grow up free from the blood and madness that consumed this place. I have given him the name Miguel Boone, after a good man who died helping my family escape the war. He will know nothing of Louisiana or the Whitmores until the day comes when he must. The letter ended with detailed instructions for finding the hidden Confederate gold, written in a code that combined Spanish and English phrases. But Elias barely registered the treasure map, his mind reeling from the revelation that his entire family history had been built on carefully constructed lies. His grandfather had not died in a cattle drive accident. He had never existed at all. Elena had created the identity of Miguel Boone to hide her son's true parentage from a world that would have seen him as the child of a deserter and a murderer. Everything Elias had believed about his heritage was fiction. But if Elena had hidden the Confederate gold and taken James's son to Texas, that meant Marcus Whitmore was right about one thing. There was a treasure somewhere on this property. And if Marcus knew about Elena's letter, he would stop at nothing to claim what he believed belonged to his family as if summoned by his thoughts. The sound of vehicles approaching echoed through the cemetery. Elias quickly pocketed Elena's letter and the pouch of coins. Then he and Evangeline made their way back toward the trees that bordered the graveyard. 3 black SUVs were parked in the mansion's driveway, and men in dark suits were systematically searching the grounds. Marcus Whitmore stood on the front porch, directing the operation with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Looks like your 3 days just got cut short," Evangeline whispered. Elias watched the armed men spreading out across his property and realized that whatever Elena had hidden here, people were still willing to kill for it more than a century later. From their hiding place among the ancient live oaks, Elias and Evangeline watched the systematic search of the mansion grounds. The men moved with military precision, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating equipment that suggested this was no casual treasure hunt. Marcus Whitmore had come prepared for serious excavation. "We need to get out of here," Evangeline whispered. These ain't the kind of men who ask polite questions. But Elias found himself reluctant to flee. His property was apparently the key to understanding his family's hidden history. Elena's letter had revealed that Confederate gold was buried somewhere on the grounds, but it had also raised troubling questions about what else might be hidden here. "There's something I need to check first," he said, pulling Elena's letter from his pocket. She mentioned burying Thomas Whitmore in an unmarked grave. If these men find his remains, it could change everything. "Honey, that was over a century ago. What difference could it make now?" Elena wrote that she killed Thomas in self-defense after he murdered James. But Marcus has been telling people that Elena was the murderer. If we can prove Thomas killed his own brother, a shout from the direction of the house cut him off. One of the searchers had found the hidden room in the basement, and Marcus was hurrying down to examine what they'd discovered. Through the basement windows, Elias could see flashlight beams dancing across the stone walls he had explored just hours earlier. "They'll find where I dug up the 4 stones," he realized. "They'll know someone got there first." Evangeline grabbed his arm. "Then we better hope they don't find what they're really looking for. Come on, I know a way off the property that won't take us past their vehicles." She led him through the cemetery and into the swampy woodland that bordered the plantation grounds. The going was treacherous. Fallen logs and standing water made every step uncertain, and the Spanish moss hung so thick it blocked most of the sunlight. But Evangeline moved through the terrain with the confidence of someone who had navigated these paths since childhood. "Where are we going?" Elias asked, swatting at mosquitoes that seemed to regard him as a feast. "My cottage is about half a mile through the swamp. We can regroup there and figure out our next move." She paused to help him over a particularly large log. "But first, you need to tell me what was in that letter your grandmother left." As they made their way through the humid maze of cypress trees and stagnant water, Elias shared Elena's revelations. Evangeline listened without comment until he finished, then sat heavily on a moss-covered stump. "Lord have mercy," she breathed. "So your grandfather wasn't Miguel Boone at all. He was James Whitmore's son. Which means I have as much claim to that property as Marcus does. Maybe more, since Elena legally owned it when she left. And the Confederate gold?" Elias consulted Elena's letter again, trying to decode the mixture of Spanish phrases and English directions she'd used to mark the treasure's location. She mentions where the morning sun touches the cross of sorrows. That could be another cemetery marker. And something about 20 paces from the weeping Virgin toward the rising sun. Evangeline's eyes widened. "I know exactly where she means. There's an old shrine in the woods, maybe 200 yards from the main cemetery. The Whitmores built it after they lost their first child to yellow fever. It's got a statue of the Virgin Mary that local folks used to visit when they needed to pray for the dead." "How much gold are we talking about?" "According to family stories, enough to fund a Confederate regiment for months. Could be worth millions today, depending on how much Elena actually hid." They reached Evangeline's cottage as the afternoon heat was building toward its daily crescendo. The small house was exactly what Elias had expected: weathered cypress siding, a tin roof, and a front porch lined with rocking chairs. But inside, he was surprised to find the walls covered with historical documents, photographs, and genealogical charts that looked like the work of a professional researcher. "You've been investigating this too," he realized. Evangeline nodded, pouring sweet tea from a pitcher in her ancient refrigerator. "Honey, I've been the unofficial keeper of this property's secrets for 60 years. When Marcus Whitmore first showed up claiming to be researching his family history, I knew he was after something more than just genealogy." She led him to a wall covered with photographs and documents spanning more than a century. At the center was a large family tree that connected the Whitmores, the Vasquez family, and surprisingly, several other local families whose names Elias recognized from his brief time in Magnolia Bend. "The thing Marcus don't understand," Evangeline continued, "is that this ain't just about one family's treasure. That gold Elena hid, it was stolen from the Union payroll that was supposed to help rebuild the South after the war. There's families in this parish who've been living in poverty for generations because that money never made it to where it was supposed to go. So what Elena hid wasn't Confederate gold, it was Union Reconstruction funds? That's what I believe. And if I'm right, then legally speaking, that treasure belongs to the federal government, not to any individual family." Elias studied the wall of documents, beginning to understand the complexity of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about his personal family history or Marcus Whitmore's greed. It was about a piece of missing American history that could rewrite the story of Reconstruction in Louisiana. But we still don't know for certain what happened between Elena, James, and Thomas, he said. "All we have is Elena's version of events." Evangeline smiled and pulled a wooden box from beneath her kitchen table. "Actually, honey, we have a little more than that." The box contained dozens of letters and documents, all carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. "I found these when I was cleaning out my grandmother's things after she died." Turns out the Thibodeau family had been collecting evidence about what really happened here for 4 generations. She handed him a letter dated March 20th, 1864, days after the baby's death, that was marked on the cemetery headstone. It was written in a man's hand and addressed to the commanding officer of whatever Union forces might find this record. "My name is Thomas Whitmore," the letter began, "and I am writing this confession because I am dying and my sins are too heavy to carry to my grave. I murdered my brother James in a jealous rage, and I tried to murder the woman he loved. But Elena Vasquez proved herself a better shot than I anticipated. And now I lie bleeding in the same cemetery where I killed my brother." The letter went on to describe the theft of Union Reconstruction funds, James's plan to return the money to federal authorities, and Thomas's decision to eliminate his brother rather than lose what he saw as his family's salvation. Elena didn't kill Thomas in cold blood, Elias realized. She killed him in self-defense, and he lived long enough to confess the truth. "There's more," Evangeline said, handing him another document. Thomas wrote down the exact location where he and James had originally hidden the stolen funds. Elena must have moved it after she killed him, but this tells us where she would have started looking. As Elias read Thomas's detailed directions, he heard the distant sound of engines starting at the mansion. Through Evangeline's kitchen window, he could see the black SUVs departing, but Marcus's sedan remained in the driveway. "They're regrouping," he said. "Marcus knows someone else has been searching for the same thing he wants." "Then we better find it first," Evangeline replied, reaching for a flashlight and a small shovel, "because once night falls, we might not get another chance." They waited until the sun began to set before venturing back toward the mansion grounds. The humidity had lifted slightly with the approaching darkness, and the evening chorus of frogs and insects provided cover for their movements through the swamp. Evangeline led the way, carrying a warm canvas bag filled with the tools they'd need for excavation. "The shrine is about a quarter-mile northeast of the main cemetery," she whispered as they picked their way through the undergrowth. "But we'll have to be careful if Marcus left any men behind. They'll likely be watching the main approaches to the house." As they emerged from the swamp onto higher ground, Elias could see the mansion in the distance, its windows dark, except for a single light in what he now knew was the basement. Someone was still searching the hidden room, probably looking for clues about what Elena had taken and where she might have hidden it. The shrine, when they found it, was even more overgrown than the cemetery. Decades of neglect had allowed the Louisiana wilderness to reclaim the small clearing where the Whitmores had once come to mourn their dead. But the stone monument at its center was still intact, a life-size statue of the Virgin Mary with her arms outstretched and her face turned upward in an expression of infinite sorrow. Water stains streaked down the Virgin's marble cheeks, creating the illusion of eternal tears that gave the statue its local name, Our Lady of Sorrows. Behind the statue, a simple stone cross marked what appeared to be an unmarked grave. 20 paces from the weeping Virgin toward the rising sun, Elias quoted from Elena's letter. That would put us somewhere in those trees to the east. But as they began measuring off the distance, Evangeline stopped him with a hand on his arm. Wait, listen. Through the evening stillness came the sound of voices, men speaking in low, urgent tones. They were coming from the direction of the mansion, moving through the woods with the systematic pattern of a search team. They're expanding their perimeter, Elias realized. We don't have much time. They moved quickly to the spot Elena's directions indicated, a patch of ground beneath a massive live oak whose twisted branches created a natural shelter from both rain and casual observation. The earth here was softer than the surrounding area, suggesting it had been disturbed at some point in the past. Evangeline began digging while Elias kept watch. The voices were getting closer, accompanied by the beams of powerful flashlights sweeping through the trees. Whatever they were going to find, they needed to find it quickly. Got something, Evangeline whispered, her shovel striking something solid about 3 feet down. Together, they cleared away the dirt to reveal a metal strongbox, its surface green with age but still intact. The lock had long since rusted away, and the lid opened with a grinding protest that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet wood stot inside. Wrapped in oiled canvas were documents that made Elias's breath catch. Bank records, federal treasury receipts, and a detailed inventory of the Union Reconstruction funds that had been stolen in 1864. But more significant was a leather journal that bore the official seal of the United States Treasury Department. Federal Agent's Logbook, Evangeline said, reading over his shoulder by flashlight. Looks like Elena wasn't just a victim in this. She was working with Union authorities to recover the stolen money. The journal told a story that recontextualized everything. They thought they knew about Elena Vasquez. She hadn't been simply a Mexican settler's daughter. Caught up in the war, she had been an undercover operative for the Union Treasury, sent to Louisiana to investigate reports of Confederate gold theft. Her romance with James Whitmore had been real, but it had also provided her with access to information about her brother's criminal activities. James never deserted from the Confederate Army, Elias realized, reading the agent's careful notes. He was feeding information to Elena about Confederate supply lines and gold shipments. They were working together. The sound of approaching voices grew louder, and flashlight beams began to probe the edges of their hiding spot. Evangeline quickly repacked the most important documents, while Elias filled in the hole they'd dug. "There's more buried here," she whispered. "The actual gold is probably in a separate cache, deeper down. But we can't risk staying to dig for it now." They made their way back toward the swamp, carrying the evidence that could prove Elena's innocence and expose the true scope of the Civil War-era conspiracy. But as they reached the tree line, a voice called out behind them. "Mr. Boone, I know you're out there." Marcus Whitmore stood in the clearing by the shrine, flanked by 2 men carrying assault rifles. His scholarly demeanor had been replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "You found something, haven't you?" Marcus continued. "I can see the fresh dirt. The question is whether you're going to be reasonable about sharing your discovery." Elias stepped out from behind the tree where he'd been hiding, leaving Evangeline concealed in the shadows with the documents. "What I found, Marcus, is proof that your ancestor was a murderer and a thief. Elena Vasquez was working for the federal government when Thomas killed James. She wasn't stealing Confederate gold. She was trying to recover stolen Union funds. Marcus's laugh was cold and brittle. A touching story, Mr. Boone, but irrelevant. Regardless of the historical details, that treasure belongs to my family. James Whitmore died for it, and I won't let his sacrifice be meaningless. James died because his brother valued money more than family. Just like you do. Perhaps, but I'm the one holding the guns. Marcus gestured to his companions, and they raised their weapons. Now, you're going to tell me exactly what you found, and then you're going to help me dig up the rest. A rifle shot cracked through the night air, but it didn't come from Marcus's men. One of them spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. From the woods behind Marcus came a voice Elias recognized: Mrs. Thibodeau, speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Drop your weapons, gentlemen. You're trespassing on private property, and Louisiana law gives me the right to defend it." She emerged from the trees, carrying an antique hunting rifle that looked well-maintained despite its age. Behind her came 3 other elderly residents of Magnolia Bend, all armed and all wearing expressions that suggested they'd been waiting a long time for this confrontation. "Evening, Marcus," said one of them, a man Elias recognized as the courthouse clerk who'd handled his property purchase. "Figured it was about time someone explained a few things to you about local history." Marcus's remaining gunmen looked uncertain, outnumbered and facing people who clearly knew the terrain better than he did. Marcus himself seemed to be calculating odds and finding them wanting. "This isn't over," he said finally, gesturing for his men to retreat. "That treasure legally belongs to the Whitmore family, and I'll get a court order if necessary." "You do that," Evangeline called from her hiding place. "But you might want to check with federal authorities first. Theft of government funds doesn't have a statute of limitations." As Marcus and his remaining gunmen disappeared into the woods, Elias felt the weight of Elena's secrets settling around him like the evening mist. He had come to Louisiana seeking solitude and found instead a family legacy built on courage, sacrifice, and the kind of moral complexities that defined the American experience itself. The courthouse clerk who had defended them introduced himself as Judge Robert Thibodeau, Evangeline's younger brother and the parish's sitting magistrate for the past 30 years. As the group gathered in the mansion's parlor later that night, burning oil lamps to avoid attracting attention with electric lights, Judge Thibodeau laid out documents that would change everything Elias thought he understood about his situation. "Marcus Whitmore isn't wrong about having a legal claim to this property," the judge began, spreading papers across the dust-covered table. "But he's been operating under some fundamental misunderstandings about which Whitmore family he belongs to." Evangeline poured coffee from a thermos, while her brother arranged the documents in chronological order. The other townspeople who had come to their aid, an elderly woman named Mrs. Boudreau and a weathered man called Pete Landry, sat quietly, their rifles propped against the wall like walking sticks. "You see," Judge Thibodeau continued, "Marcus has been claiming descent from Captain James Whitmore through the male line. But according to parish records, James never had any children who lived to adulthood." "What about the baby Elena had?" Elias asked. "The one buried in the cemetery? That child died within hours of birth, just like the headstone says. But Elena was pregnant twice during her time at this house. The first pregnancy ended in the stillbirth that's recorded in the cemetery. The second pregnancy resulted in a healthy son who lived to adulthood, your grandfather." Judge Thibodeau handed Elias a birth certificate dated September 1864, 6 months after Elena's supposed departure for Texas. Miguel Boone, or as he was originally registered, Miguel Whitmore, was born right here in this house. Elena stayed in Louisiana much longer than anyone realized. The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. "She didn't leave immediately after James died?" "No, sir. According to these records, Elena remained on the property for almost a year. After the events of March 1864, she was completing her mission for the Treasury Department, documenting the full extent of the Confederate gold theft and recovering as much of the stolen funds as possible. Mrs. Boudreau spoke up from her chair by the window. "My grandmother was the midwife who delivered your grandfather, Mr. Boone. She always said Elena was the bravest woman she ever knew, staying here alone with a baby, dodging Confederate patrols and treasure hunters, all while gathering evidence for the federal government." "But if Elena was working for the Treasury Department," Elias said, "why didn't she turn over the gold she recovered? Why hide it instead of returning it to federal authorities?" Judge Thibodeau's expression grew grave. "Because she discovered something that made her distrust those authorities. Something that's been buried in federal archives for over a century, until I requested the files under the Freedom of Information Act last year." He opened a folder, marked with official government seals, and withdrew a telegram dated August 1864. "This is correspondence between Elena's Treasury Department handler and his superiors in Washington. Read it carefully." The telegram was brief but devastating. "Agent Vasquez has recovered approximately $200,000 in stolen Reconstruction funds. Recommend termination of agent and recovery of funds for alternative use. Louisiana operations too sensitive for civilian oversight." Elias read the message twice before its implications sank in. They were planning to kill her and steal the money themselves. The Treasury Department agent assigned to Elena's case was corrupt, Judge Thibodeau explained. He was working with Confederate sympathizers who wanted to use the recovered gold to fund post-war resistance activities. Elena figured out the double cross and decided to hide the treasure until she could find federal authorities she could trust. "But she never did," Evangeline added. "According to family letters I found, Elena spent the rest of her life trying to contact honest officials in Washington, but the corruption went too high up the chain. She finally gave up and decided to leave the gold hidden until someone trustworthy could claim it." Pete Landry cleared his throat and spoke for the first time since they'd gathered. "That's where Marcus Whitmore's claim gets complicated. See, he's been telling folks he's descended from James Whitmore, but genealogy records show he's actually descended from the corrupt Treasury agent, a man named William Whitmore, who took the name when he settled in Louisiana after the war." The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Marcus had been searching for treasure that his ancestor had tried to steal, not knowing that the very woman he'd been vilifying had hidden it to keep it away from his family. "So Marcus has no legal claim to the property or the treasure," Elias said. "Worse than that," Judge Thibodeau replied. "If the gold is still buried here, it legally belongs to the federal government. Elena was acting as a federal agent when she recovered it, which means she was holding it in trust for the United States Treasury." Mrs. Boudreau leaned forward in her chair. "But there's something else you need to know, Mr. Boone. Something about why Marcus really wants that treasure so badly." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a manila folder. "My grandson works for the D in New Orleans. Last month, he mentioned an investigation into someone using historical research as a cover for money laundering operations. When I heard the name Marcus Whitmore, I asked him to look into it. The folder contained surveillance photographs and financial documents that painted a picture of Marcus as far more than an obsessed genealogist. He was apparently the front man for a criminal organization that specialized in recovering lost treasures and artifacts for private collectors who didn't ask questions about provenance. The Confederate gold would be worth millions on the black market, Pete Landry explained. But more importantly, Marcus's organization has been using historical societies and genealogy research to identify and loot archaeological sites across the South. The Whitmore treasure would give them enough capital to expand their operations nationwide. Elias studied the surveillance photos. Seeing Marcus in meetings with men whose faces suggested they were more comfortable with violence than with scholarly research. How many people know about this investigation? That's the problem, Mrs. Boudreau said. My grandson thinks there might be someone inside the feeding information to Marcus's organization. The federal agents who were supposed to be monitoring this property haven't been seen for 3 days. The implications sent a chill through the room. If Marcus had corrupted federal law enforcement, then simply turning over the evidence they'd gathered might not be enough to stop him. And if he was willing to kill federal agents to protect his operation, he certainly wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a few elderly townspeople and a Texas rancher. We need to get that treasure out of the ground tonight, Judge Thibodeau said. If we can document its recovery and get word to honest federal authorities before Marcus realizes what we found, we might be able to stop his operation permanently. Evangeline stood up and checked the ammunition in her rifle. Then we better get started. Pete knows how to operate that ground-penetrating equipment Marcus's men left behind. And Mrs. Boudreau's grandson gave her a satellite phone that can reach D headquarters directly. As they prepared to return to the shrine, Elias realized that Elena's final gift to her descendants wasn't just hidden treasure. It was a chance to finish the mission she had started over a century ago. But first, they would have to survive long enough to complete what she had begun. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the Louisiana night. Marcus Whitmore was returning with reinforcements, and this time he wouldn't be content with threats and intimidation. The final confrontation over Elena's legacy was about to begin, and Elias found himself wondering if a 72-year-old cattle rancher had enough fight left in him to honor his grandmother's courage. The answer, he suspected, was about to be tested in ways that would determine not just his own survival, but the fate of a treasure that had already cost too many lives to count. The sound of engines grew louder as Marcus's convoy approached the mansion. From the parlor windows, Elias could see headlights cutting through the Spanish moss. At least 6 vehicles this time. Marcus had clearly decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. Judge Thibodeau moved to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. That's a lot more firepower than we can handle in a direct confrontation. We need to get to that shrine before they can establish a perimeter around the entire property. How much time do we have? Elias asked, checking the load in his father's old service revolver, the only weapon he'd brought from Texas. Maybe 20 minutes before they organize a systematic search, Pete Landry replied. He was examining the ground-penetrating radar equipment that Marcus's men had abandoned near the cemetery. This gear is top-quality stuff. We can locate the main treasure cache in half that time if we're lucky. Mrs. Boudreau was speaking quietly into the satellite phone, trying to raise someone at D headquarters who could coordinate federal response. But even if she succeeded, help would be hours away, far too late to prevent Marcus from recovering the treasure or eliminating the witnesses to his operation. Evangeline shouldered her rifle and headed for the back door. We go through the swamp again. It's the only route they won't expect, and the terrain will slow down anyone trying to follow us. As they prepared to leave, Elias took one last look around the mansion that had been his refuge for barely 3 days. The house seemed different now, not the sanctuary he'd purchased for his final years, but a monument to the complexity of American history and the price of standing up for what was right. Elena lived here for almost a year, he said to Evangeline. Alone with a baby, surrounded by enemies, completing a mission that could have gotten her killed at any moment. I'm not sure I have that kind of courage. Honey, Evangeline replied, checking the spare ammunition in her pocket. Courage ain't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs doing despite the fear. And from what I've seen, you got more of your grandmother's backbone than you realize. They made their way through the darkened house to the kitchen door, moving by feel and memory to avoid using lights that might give away their position. Outside, the sounds of systematic search were already beginning, doors slamming. men calling to each other. Equipment being unloaded and organized. The journey through the swamp was treacherous in full darkness. What had been merely difficult during their earlier crossing became actively dangerous with only starlight to guide them. Standing water concealed fallen logs and hidden roots that could break an ankle. And a chorus of nocturnal wildlife masked the sound of their movement, but also prevented them from hearing potential pursuit. Judge Thibodeau led the way. His familiarity with the terrain dating back to childhood, hunting expeditions with his father, Mrs. Boudreau moved with surprising agility for her age. Her DIA connections, apparently including some field training, that served her well in difficult terrain. Pete Landry brought up the rear, carrying the ground-penetrating equipment and watching for signs they were being followed. When they reached the shrine clearing, Pete immediately began setting up the radar unit while the others established a defensive perimeter. The equipment hummed to life, its display screen showing a three-dimensional map of what lay beneath the ground around Our Lady of Sorrows. "There," Pete whispered, pointing to a dense cluster of metallic signatures about 8 feet directly below the Virgin Mary statue. "That's got to be the main cache. Looks like multiple containers buried at the same depth." "How long to dig down to them?" Judge Thibodeau asked. "With proper tools and help, maybe an hour. But we don't have proper tools, and we can't risk the noise of power equipment." Elias studied the readout, remembering Elena's coded directions from her letter. She had been specific about the location for a reason: 20 paces from the Weeping Virgin toward the rising sun. But what if she hadn't meant 20 paces from where the statue stood now? "Evangeline," he said, "you mentioned that this shrine was built after the Whitmores lost their first child. When exactly was that?" 1823, I think. Why?" "Elena's letter was written in 1864. The statue might have been moved or replaced during those 40 years. He consulted Elena's letter again, noting details he had missed before. She mentions where the morning sun touches the cross of sorrows, but there's a cross behind the statue. What if that's the original marker? Pete moved the radar unit to scan the area around the stone cross, and immediately the display lit up with new signatures. Bingo! Multiple large metallic objects, maybe 6 feet down. This location makes more sense strategically to better concealment, easier access without being seen from the house. They began digging in shifts, 2 people working while the others maintained watch. The Louisiana soil was soft but treacherous, becoming muddy as they reached the water table. Every shovelful had to be carefully placed to avoid creating obvious signs of excavation that Marcus's men might notice. Mrs. Boudreau's satellite phone finally connected with someone at D headquarters. But the conversation was frustrating. The agent she reached knew about the investigation into Marcus's organization, but had no immediate way to dispatch help to their location. Federal resources were stretched thin, and a rural Louisiana treasure hunt wasn't considered high priority, even with the money laundering implications. "Tell them about the missing federal agents," Judge Thibodeau suggested. "That might change their priorities." Mrs. Boudreau relayed the information, and the tone of the conversation shifted immediately. Missing federal agents were always a priority, regardless of the circumstances. But the earliest help could arrive would be dawn still hours away. "We're on our own until morning," she reported, ending the call. At 4 feet down, Pete's shovel struck something solid, working carefully to avoid noise. They cleared away the remaining dirt to reveal the edge of a wooden crate bound with iron straps. The wood was partially rotted but still intact, and stenciled on the side in faded letters were the words, U.S. Treasury Department Reconstruction Fund, Louisiana District. "That's it," Elias breathed. Elena really did recover the stolen money. But as they worked to expose more of the cash, the sound of approaching voices made them freeze. Flashlight beams were moving through the woods toward their location, accompanied by the deliberate footsteps of multiple men advancing in formation. "They found our trail," Pete whispered, maybe 10 minutes before they reach us. Judge Thibodeau checked his rifle and positioned himself behind the largest tree in the clearing. We need to document what we found and get word out before they can silence us permanently. Evangeline was already using her phone to photograph the exposed treasure crate and the ground-penetrating radar display. If we can't get the treasure out, at least we can prove it exists and belongs to the federal government. Mrs. Boudreau resumed contact with the D, this time speaking in the urgent tones of someone reporting an active crime in progress. But even as she described their location and situation, the approaching voices grew closer and more organized. Elias found himself thinking about Elena again, his grandmother who had faced similar odds in the same location more than a century earlier. She had been surrounded by enemies, protecting evidence that could expose corruption reaching to the highest levels of government. She had chosen to stand her ground rather than run, trusting that future generations would understand the importance of what she was protecting. Now that future generation was him, and the choice was the same. They could try to flee through the swamp and probably be hunted down one by one, or they could make their stand here and hope that documenting the truth would be enough to stop Marcus's operation. Judge, Elias said quietly, in your opinion, if we can prove that this treasure belongs to the federal government and that Marcus is attempting to steal it, does that give us legal justification to defend it by force? The old magistrate smiled grimly. Mr. Boone, any citizen has the right to prevent the theft of government property. Elena understood that when she killed Thomas Whitmore. The question is whether we're prepared to follow her example. The flashlight beams were close enough now to illuminate the edge of their clearing. Marcus's voice carried through the night air, giving orders to his men to surround the shrine and take the treasure hunters alive if possible. Positions, Judge Thibodeau whispered. And remember, we're not just fighting for treasure. We're fighting to finish what Elena started. As they took cover around the clearing, Elias felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. His grandmother had given up everything to protect this secret. His grandfather had grown up never knowing his true heritage because Elena had sacrificed her own happiness to complete her mission. Now it was his turn to choose between safety and principle, between running away from the past and confronting it head-on. The approaching footsteps and voices made the choice urgent, but in his heart, Elias knew the decision had already been made the moment he found Elena's photograph in that hidden basement room. Marcus Whitmore stepped into the clearing with 6 armed men spread out behind him, their weapons trained on the defensive positions around the shrine. In the harsh glare of tactical flashlights, he looked less like a scholar and more like what he truly was, a criminal willing to kill for profit. Mr. Boone, Marcus called out, his voice carrying false reasonableness. I can see you found what we're all looking for. There's no need for this to end badly. Simply step away from the excavation, and we can discuss terms like civilized men. Elias remained crouched behind the stone base of the Virgin Mary statue, his father's revolver steady in his hands. The irony wasn't lost on him. Taking shelter behind a monument to maternal sorrow, while defending the legacy his own grandmother had died protecting. The only terms I'm interested in, Elias replied, are the ones where you and your men leave this property and turn yourselves into federal authorities. Marcus laughed, a sound without warmth in the humid Louisiana night. I'm afraid that's not going to happen. You see, you've made a fundamental error in judgment, Mr. Boone. You've assumed this is about money, but it's really about power. The treasure down there represents more than gold. It represents the ability to fund operations that governments can't or won't support. From her position behind the stone cross, Mrs. Boudreau spoke quietly into the satellite phone, maintaining contact with the D while documenting everything Marcus was revealing. Every word could be crucial evidence if any of them survived the next few minutes. You're talking about terrorism, Judge Thibodeau said from his tree cover. Using Civil War gold to fund modern criminal operations. "I'm talking about freedom," Marcus replied. "Freedom from government interference in private enterprise. Your precious Elena Vasquez was a federal agent, a representative of the same oppressive system that's destroying American liberty today. She stole property that rightfully belonged to the South." Pete Landry had been quietly working to expose more of the treasure cache while the others kept Marcus talking. Now he looked up from his digging with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Mr. Boone, you need to see this." Still keeping his weapon trained on Marcus's position, Elias glanced down at what Pete had uncovered. Alongside the Treasury Department crate was another container, this one bearing Confederate markings and filled with military dispatches and official documents. "Confederate intelligence reports," Pete whispered. "Looks like Elena recovered more than just stolen money. She found evidence of Confederate spy networks that were planning post-war resistance operations." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Those documents were destroyed." "Apparently not," Elias called out. "Elena was more thorough than anyone realized. She didn't just recover the stolen Reconstruction funds. She documented the entire Confederate intelligence operation. Names, locations, funding sources, everything." Marcus's carefully controlled facade began to crack. "Those documents belong to my family. My ancestor died protecting Confederate secrets." "Your ancestor was a corrupt federal agent," Judge Thibodeau corrected. "And these documents belong in the National Archives, not in the hands of criminals." The standoff stretched taut as both sides calculated their options. Marcus had superior firepower, but he was operating on unfamiliar terrain against people who had grown up in these woods. More importantly, Mrs. Boudreau's satellite phone connection meant that everything happening here was being recorded by federal authorities. Evangeline broke the silence. "Marcus, your grandmother was Susanna Whitmore, wasn't she? William Whitmore's daughter?" Marcus seemed startled by the personal reference. "How do you know that name?" "Because my grandmother delivered her baby in 1923. Sweet little girl. Born right here in Magnolia Bend. Susanna used to visit this shrine every year on the anniversary of her father's death, praying for his forgiveness." Evangeline's voice carried decades of accumulated knowledge. She knew what William had done. She spent her whole life trying to atone for his crimes. "My grandmother was a saint," Marcus snapped. "She understood the importance of preserving Southern heritage against federal aggression." "Your grandmother was ashamed," Evangeline continued. "Ashamed that her father had betrayed his oath to serve the federal government. She told my grandmother the truth before she died. William Whitmore had planned to steal the Confederate intelligence documents and sell them to the highest bidder after the war." Elena Vasquez stopped him. The personal attack seemed to unbalance Marcus more than threats of federal prosecution. His scholarly composure cracked completely, revealing the fanatic underneath. "Enough," he snarled, raising his weapon. "I've wasted too much time on this negotiation. Kill them all and secure the site." But as Marcus's men raised their rifles, the night exploded with the sound of approaching helicopters. Federal agents, alerted by Mrs. Boudreau's satellite phone calls, were arriving ahead of schedule. Searchlights swept through the trees, and amplified voices demanded that all armed individuals drop their weapons immediately. Marcus spun toward the sound of the helicopters, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "You called in federal reinforcements." "I called in the rightful owners of this treasure," Mrs. Boudreau replied, standing up from her concealed position with her hands raised. "The United States government." The helicopters settled into the clearing beyond the shrine, disgorging tactical teams that immediately moved to secure the area. Marcus and his men found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and caught in the act of attempting to steal federal property. Federal agents in tactical gear moved through the clearing with practiced efficiency, but Marcus Whitmore wasn't finished. As the helicopter's searchlights swept across the shrine, He grabbed something from his jacket, not a weapon, but a small electronic device that beeped ominously in the humid night air. "Everyone back away from the excavation," Marcus shouted over the rotor noise. "I've placed charges around this site. If I can't have the treasure, no one can." Agent Sarah Chun, the D-Team leader who had rappelled from the first helicopter, immediately recognized the threat. "Explosive device," she called into her radio. "All units maintain distance from the shrine." Elias felt his blood turn to ice. Marcus was willing to destroy Elena's legacy rather than see it return to rightful federal custody. Over a century of hidden history would be lost in a blast that would serve no purpose except to satisfy one man's twisted sense of revenge. "You're bluffing," Judge Thibodeau said. But his voice lacked conviction. Marcus held up the detonator, his thumb hovering over the trigger button. "Am I? I've had 3 days to prepare this site. Mr. Thibodeau, I've been planning for this contingency since I first started searching for the treasure." Agent Chan moved closer, her weapon trained on Marcus, while her team worked to evacuate civilians from the potential blast radius. "Mr. Whitmore, destroying federal property is a felony that carries a life sentence. Think about what you're doing." "I'm preserving Southern heritage from federal theft," Marcus replied, his academic composure completely shattered. "Elena Vasquez was a traitor who stole what belonged to the Confederate cause. If I can't restore it to its rightful place, at least I can prevent it from being used by her descendants and their government allies." But as Marcus ranted about Southern heritage and federal oppression, Evangeline was moving quietly through the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Her decades of experience on this property had taught her every route, every depression, every approach that would allow silent movement. While everyone's attention was focused on the standoff between Marcus and Agent Chun, she circled behind his position. Elias saw her movement and understood her intention. She was positioning herself to tackle Marcus if necessary, but the detonator in his hand made any physical intervention incredibly dangerous. One wrong move, and the explosive charges would destroy everything Elena had died protecting. "Marcus," Elias called out, drawing the man's attention away from Evangeline's approach. "You keep talking about Southern heritage, but you don't understand what really happened here. Elena wasn't stealing from the South. She was protecting it from criminals who would have used Confederate symbols to justify theft and murder." "Lies," Marcus spat. "Federal propaganda designed to justify Northern aggression." "Then explain this," Elias said, pulling Elena's original letter from his pocket. "Your ancestor, William Whitmore, wasn't a Confederate officer. He was a corrupt federal agent who planned to steal both Union Reconstruction funds and Confederate intelligence documents." Elena stopped him from betraying both sides. Marcus's face contorted with rage. "My family fought for the Confederacy. We bled for Southern independence. Your family betrayed everyone they claimed to serve," Judge Thibodeau added. "William Whitmore was a war profiteer who saw the Civil War as an opportunity for personal enrichment." 3 months later, Elias sat on the restored front porch of the Whitmore Mansion, watching the morning sun filter through Spanish moss that no longer seemed ominous but protective. The federal investigation had concluded. Marcus and his organization had been prosecuted, and the treasure Elena had hidden for over a century had been returned to the Treasury Department for proper disposition. The mansion itself had been designated a National Historic Landmark, its basement room and hidden shrine recognized as significant sites in Civil War and Reconstruction history. Elena Vasquez's story had been added to the official record, her courage finally acknowledged by the government she had served with such dedication. But for Elias, the most important changes were personal. The loneliness that had driven him from Texas had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something more manageable. The quiet solitude of a man who understood his place in a larger story. He was no longer simply the last member of a dying family line. but a link in a chain of courage that stretched back through generations. Evangeline emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the morning mail. At 86, she had officially been hired as the mansion's historical interpreter, a federal position that came with a small apartment in the restored servants' quarters and a pension that would ensure her comfort for the remaining years. "Got a letter from your lawyer in Texas," she said, settling into the rocking chair beside his. "Looks like the ranch sale went through." Elias had decided to sell the Broken Arrow Ranch and use the proceeds to establish the Elena Vasquez Foundation, a nonprofit organization that would provide college scholarships for students studying American history and government service. It seemed fitting that his grandmother's legacy should inspire new generations of public servants. "Any regrets?" Evangeline asked, watching him read the legal documents. "About selling the ranch?" "No. Sarah and I built that place together, but it was never really home after she died. This," he gestured toward the mansion and its grounds, "this feels like where I'm supposed to be." The restoration of the mansion had become a community project, with local volunteers working alongside federal contractors to return the house to something approaching its original grandeur. Judge Thibodeau had established a historical society that was documenting the stories of all the families affected by the Civil War and Reconstruction in Magnolia. Bend Mrs. Boudreau had been recruited by the D as a consultant on historical crimes, her combination of local knowledge and federal contacts proving invaluable for ongoing investigations. Pete Landry had surprised everyone by revealing a degree in archaeology from LSU, hidden beneath decades of blue-collar work. He was now the official site supervisor for the ongoing excavation of the shrine and cemetery, uncovering artifacts that added depth and complexity to the historical record. But perhaps the most significant discovery had been made in Elena's own records, found in a safety deposit box in New Orleans that the Treasury Department had located during their investigation. Her detailed reports to federal authorities provided a comprehensive account of Confederate intelligence operations in Union counterintelligence efforts that historians had never fully understood. She was remarkable, Elias said, thinking of the woman whose photograph had started his journey of discovery. She sacrificed everything for a mission she believed in, never knowing if anyone would understand or appreciate what she'd done. "She knew," Evangeline replied. "My grandmother used to say Elena had a look in her eyes like someone who could see the future." She trusted that eventually the truth would come out. A car approached along the newly paved driveway, a federal sedan carrying Agent Chen and a man Elias didn't recognize. They had been expecting this visit, the final official meeting about the disposition of Elena's treasure and the legal status of the mansion property. Agent Chen introduced her companion as Dr. Michael Harrison from the Smithsonian Institution. He was a historian specializing in Civil War espionage, and he had been studying Elena's reports for the past 3 months. "Mr. Boone," Dr. Harrison began, "I wanted to thank you personally for your family's contribution to American historical understanding. Elena Vasquez's records have filled in gaps in our knowledge that we didn't even know existed. She was apparently one of the most effective intelligence operatives of the entire war. What happens to her story now?" Elias asked. "The Smithsonian is planning a major exhibition on Civil War espionage, with Elena as the central figure. We'd like to display some of her personal effects alongside the official documents, if you're willing to lend them." Elias thought of the photograph that had started everything. The image of a young woman whose courage had shaped American history in ways she never could have imagined. "I think she'd like that. She spent her whole life working for the federal government. It's fitting that the federal government should tell her story." Agent Chen handed him a thick envelope containing the final paperwork related to the treasure recovery. "There's also the matter of the finder's fee," she said. Federal law provides compensation for citizens who assist in recovering stolen government property. It's not a fortune, but it should be enough to maintain this property and continue Elena's legacy. As their official visitors departed, Elias and Evangeline returned to their rocking chairs on the front porch. The afternoon was warm but not oppressive, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of the gardens that were slowly being restored to their antebellum glory. "So what now?" Evangeline asked. "You've got your grandmother's story. Her treasure's been returned to the government, and the bad guys are in prison. What does a 72-year-old retired rancher do for an encore?" Elias smiled, feeling more at peace than he had in years. "I think I'll just sit here for a while and enjoy being part of something bigger than myself." Elena spent her whole life protecting this place and what it represented. Now it's my turn to be its guardian. The sun continued its journey across the Louisiana sky, and somewhere in the restored gardens, a mockingbird began to sing. Elena Vasquez's work was finally complete, and her great-grandson had found the home he never knew he was looking for.